Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wasatch Report here on the Cerberus Radio Network. I am Suzanne Sherman, and it is Thursday, April 12th, year of our Lord, 2018. Here over at the Cerberus Radio Network, we defend freedom and liberty from the flames of tyranny. Jeff Johnson is joining me in the studio today. Not only is he my producer, he's going to be acting as my co-host today. We weren't sure if we were going to get a show on the books today, but we kind of decided at the last minute that we're going to get her done. There's a lot to talk about. We do have a phone number here, 717-467-1736. You can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network. Our radio fan page, also of the same origin, facebook.com/CRN. I'm there as well. For now, my Facebook page seems to be up and running. I haven't been thrown in the slammer for a few weeks now, and that is facebook.com/Cowgirl Esquire or Suzanne Sherman. I've got a couple pages there. We're going to try and consolidate. We also now are using MeWe, trying to get people over there. And I know people are saying, yeah, that's a leftist tool running that organization as well. And, you know, for me, I want to have a backup. I want to be able to get these articles out when I print them. I had one come out from the 10th Amendment Center last Thursday, and I will be talking about that a little bit later on. Again, the common thread is federalism. This topic is going to be about marijuana and what we can learn from federal regulations and the prohibition era when it comes to alcohol. So we'll get to that in a little bit. And let's see, we also have a YouTube page. We are trying to get away from YouTube as well. Jeff, it's really hard to find sources that aren't really censoring us. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg came on to before Congress and testified that, of course, they're not censoring anybody based on their particular views, or it's all about keeping us safe from terrorism. So needless to say, what is it? Those diamond unlaced ladies haven't been censored, or we just happen to not see them at all. So we're trying to get away from it, but we do have YouTube. We also have a radio.co availability for you to go onto an app we have for the Android platform. And if you push that Cerberus Radio Network link on the app on your Android device, you can listen to a loop where we have shows. We update them, so you're not going to find anything that's really out of date. We keep it current, adding to that roster of talent we have that you can listen to. And again, it rolls 24/7. We have a good friend, Dave Benner. He's been on my show before. He's the author of a book called Compact of the Union. It describes how 13 sovereign and independent nation states came together and formed a voluntary union. Awesome, awesome resource. He also has a booklet called The 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine. It will take you less than an hour to read it, and you will know more about incorporation, the intent of the Bill of Rights, than any federal court judge or any law school professor. So I highly recommend that. Also, if you're interested in expanding your knowledge, we have worked out with Tom Woods of Liberty Classroom a special discount for our Cerberus Radio Network listeners. If you go to libertyclassroom.com and purchase a basic membership, it is $89. You can get $40 discount on that membership using the code word or the code letters CRN for Cerberus Radio Network. That's a fantastic deal. So I'm really excited to offer that. If people understood the true, as opposed to the revisionist history of our foundations, we would not be in the mess we are in today. People are looking at more and more government. We're hearing inaccurate discussions, false narratives on even the conservative talk radio, on television. They're all wrong. Jeff, I got to tell you, when I was home visiting my parents last week, they had two lawyers on Fox Radio with their journalist discussing, I think there's a ban on assault rifles in Deerfield. I think it's Deerfield, Illinois. I have the page up somewhere. But here's the point. They were both going to discuss the legal and constitutional implications of this assault weapons ban, local ban. And I'm sitting there watching this, and I told my mom's caregiver, I said, watch this now. Everybody's going to be wrong on the entire panel. And sure enough, they were. The attorney that was a criminal defense attorney that was in support of the ban cited a Seventh Court opinion that said that the assault weapons were not covered under the Second Amendment. And to determine that, they go to Heller, where Justice Antonin Scalia, our constitutional originalist, declared what is allowed and what isn't, that we all have a personal right to keep and bear arms inside our home for personal defense. But certainly that was not the implication there, is that weapons of war, that's the rhetoric here, were not included. So we cite a decision that was bad, that wasn't even, there was no authority under the Constitution for the federal judiciary to even hear firearms cases. Again, there's no authority for them to regulate. That means there's no authority for them to define what these rights are. We also have to, again, get away from the supposition that these are rights. We hear this time and time again. It's restriction on the general government. So they don't get to define what our rights are when they're out and out prohibited from discussing this, regulating this in the first place. So now the other pundit was on there saying, well, this is obviously a violation of our Second Amendment rights, not because of the fact that this was really a state violation, depending on what that state constitution says. For instance, Utah's constitution says we have a right to keep and bear arms, but that right is subject to legislation, to the whim of the legislature. So I think our Utah constitution is horrible, not as bad as California, which doesn't provide for it at all. But I'm starting to realize that there really isn't a practical difference for the two. So what we have here is really this de facto, this we're indoctrinated to look to what does the Supreme Court or what does the federal judiciary say when it comes to our firearm rights. And I just am in the final phases, actually, of writing an article on this recent debacle and the tone that's being undertaken with regards to the assault weapon, the assault rifle bans that we're hearing a call for in response to the Parkland shooting incident. So I have an angle that I'm covering on this that you are not hearing from the mainstream media. Carl Jones is going to be looking at it next week. He'll be chiming in, putting his contributions in there, and then we're going to shoot that one over, no pun intended, to the 10th Amendment Center, and hopefully that will be published in a week or two. So, Jeff, we've had a lot going on. It looks like we are on the brink of a war with Russia over Syria, because apparently Syria is trying to fight some ISIS, some terrorists, some really bad guys that we created. And we are going to say, we're going to dictate the means by which they do that. So if they do that via some sort of a weapon or a chemical weapon or an incendiary device over which we disapprove, we are going to launch missiles into their sovereign territory. I don't know about you, but I voted for Donald Trump because he campaigned on a platform that is in direct contravention to his behavior. But this isn't the first time that we've had a candidate and a president do two entirely different things. What are your thoughts on Syria?
Well, it's just really interesting. I saw a meme just for you. I said it correctly, or I don't know what's correct way. Anyway, I saw a meme earlier today where it has a picture of Assad sitting there and says, listen, we're beating ISIS. We're beating these rebels. We're on the verge of winning, blah, blah, blah. So why don't I drop chemical weapons and get the whole world mad at me? So they're all going to come in over here and try to kill me now. There's this whole incident defies logic. There's only two people that benefit from dropping using these chemical weapons, if in fact they were actually used. There's no proof that they were actually used, just pictures by rebels claiming that they were used. So there's only two people that benefit. One, the rebels, because now there's all these people wanting to join them. They're going to get a new influx of people that will come in and fight. to destroy Syria and put it under a caliphate, just like Libya. We helped destroy Libya. Now that's a real mess. We helped destroy Egypt. It's less of a mess. The people there, the more moderate people, took back that country to a certain extent. Now we're going to try to destroy this very modern, very moderate Islamic regime. They may be bad guys, but they're definitely more moderate than these ISIS people. So they benefit from it. Let me just finish. The second person that benefits. Right. There's only two people: the rebels and the United States government. So now who gets to make a whole billions and billions and trillions of dollars worth of more arms to sell all over the world, to drop on people, to kill more people? Who benefits? The rebels and U.S. government. That is the honest to God logic of this whole thing. You cannot come up with one reason why Assad would benefit from it. He's beating them. He's winning. He has the Russians backing them. They're a first world country. They have top of the line armament. They are not losing. There's no reason for him to use these weapons. It defies logic. There's only two people that benefit, and we are going to see them spending trillions more dollars to arm people all over the world here in the United States. Go ahead, Susan. I'm sorry.
Well, remember the famous quote, "War is a racket" by Major General Smedley Butler. And, there's also another book that people should look at. It's called A Century of War. I've started to go through that as well. I believe Mises put it out. And it just shows that we have all these excuses to enter into these wars that are purely not defensive. I mean, tell me what freedoms we have that need to be defended in Syria. And I want to go back. You mentioned Egypt, and I don't know, nobody called him on this. President Obama, when we had this whole Arab Spring and the Egyptian government was now being replaced, and we had the Muslim Brotherhood as a major player in there. And we had a newscaster ask Obama, isn't the Muslim Brotherhood, isn't that against American interests? Don't you think that they are a risk if they take charge of Egypt? Do you think that is really a good thing? And then rather than answer the question, the answer would have been, yes, you are absolutely correct. The Muslim Brotherhood is anti-American. He said, look, the Muslim Brotherhood is but one of many factions vying for a voice in Egypt. And he got a pass. They didn't even pursue it. How about Mr. President answering the damn question? But they let him skate with this all the time. And fortunately, the people of Egypt, I think they ended up replacing the government and got the Muslim Brotherhood out of there. But this is just an example of the absolute mess we are putting forth over in the Middle East. And for what purpose? Well, we heard George Bush say we're going to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. Well, what are we doing now? We're bringing them in as refugees, where these refugees are getting government handouts two or three times the amount that Americans are getting. So, if we're going to be giving out these handouts, we should be really looking at, why are we bringing these people here? And we've gone against that whole justification. We're going to fight them there, so we don't have to fight them here. And look what's happening now. We are getting these problems over here, and then the media tries to cover it up. So, I just think that once again, this whole big national blob is the reason we're having these problems. I've just been feeling very dejected. Like, why are we even doing this? Now we've got Pompeo being the confirmation hearings for Pompeo as the Secretary of State. I think he was a former head of the CIA, who's now saying this rhetoric, well, we have to get tough. It's time we got tough with Russia. Why do we have to fight with everybody? This whole thing with Syria, I think, has the potential to really get overblown. And I asked myself now, because I'm the mother of two teenage boys, one is 19, one is 17. And Jeff, if this were to really get out of hand, could you see possibly another draft coming along? Now, the people that chose not to fight in Vietnam were considered draft dodgers. We see them castigated, and they're put down. They're told that they were defectors. They weren't patriotic. But knowing what I do now, I think that supposed draft dodgers were completely justified. Why did we need to go into Vietnam? We ended up giving it away anyway. Government expanded. We made a lot of money selling bombs, but did we end up winning anything? No, we surrendered the whole country to the communists. And guess what? The domino theory proved incorrect. The whole world isn't communist, at least not because of Vietnam. It's because of our own stupidity and our own, what we refer to, I always call the trifecta of evil: the government, the education system, and the media. The latter two, which are governed by the former through regulations, licensing, grants, etc. So here we are now looking at a war in Syria. And if your boys are drafted, do you think, Jeff, what would you do if your boys were drafted, your son was drafted to fight in Syria?
I would suggest him go to Canada. Here's the deal. Okay, all you conservatives out there that are so gung-ho about going to war there, you are not really that conservative because, number one, okay, so let's assume that the AUMF, the authorization to use military force, gives Trump the authority to use force to defend against an imminent attack. What is the imminent attack against these United States? There is none. We're talking about Syria. We're talking about a civil war, and that is a civil war because that is two factions within that state trying to gain power, or one trying to keep their power, one trying to take it away from them. That is a civil war. We have no reason to be there. So the authorization to use military force doesn't apply because there is no imminent threat against the United States. So if you're such a big conservative, all you people out there that want war, let's go to the Constitution. Let's read Article 1, Section 8, the delegated powers to Congress, not the president, to Congress, to declare war. 3 words. That's the only one. That's the only ones that has those words in it. Not the judiciary, not the executive, just Congress to declare war. So can Congress give the president the right? Suzanne, here we go. Can the president be given the right to declare wars by the Congress?
Well, we've seen with the War Powers Act, that was an unconstitutional delegation of power to the executive. And here's the thing, too. Let's say, go ahead.
They amended the Constitution, didn't they? They amended the Constitution by legislation.
And that's what we have. We have constitutional amendments by legislative or judicial fiat, but not by the Article 5 amendment process, which requires ratification by 3/4 of the states. And we have accepted this as, well, it's just too much trouble to get it done. It's not going to happen. I believe Mises had a recent article, Ryan McMakin wrote this, that it's really easy to repeal the Second Amendment. And all you have to do is get enough justices or legislators to agree that, you know, we need to have some common sense regulations. We've already capitulated the fact that this is a right, and rights are subject to regulation. So therefore, it's not going to take a convention of the states, ratification by the states, to repeal it. So people ask, well, what do you do then? I had this discussion on K-Talk last week where the host was saying, well, you know, with regards to unconstitutional laws, and if there's, for instance, we were talking about the incorporation doctrine, I said the states need to nullify, ignore unconstitutional laws. The federal government has no legal authority to use state resources to enforce unconstitutional laws also. So that's how we do that at the federal level. And he said, well, what about when your states are violating your rights? And I said, well, we have, you know, it's a multifaceted approach. We have several tiers here. So you first have to seek redress within your own state, hopefully within the legislative or judicial forums. And he said, well, what if you can't get redress there? Like in California, there's no way you're going to have any sort of favorable resolution if you're pro firearms in that state. So I said, well, then you either vote with your feet or civil disobedience. When I was on the air, you even sent me a message about the SAFE Act in New York. So why don't you get into a little bit about civil disobedience in New York and how effective that was? Are you there, Jeff?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I'm always doing stuff in the background, and I always mute myself, and I forgot I muted the mic. Sorry about that. So
Okay.
I'll edit that dead space out later.
I'm sure what you said was brilliant. We just didn't hear it.
Yes. New York State passed a set of laws. I'm not quite sure what year it is. I don't even remember. It's called the New York Safe Act. In it, it's basically a bunch of regulations that demand gun registration, so they can have that way they know exactly where all the guns are. That's what Hitler did prior to the gun confiscation. He required registration. Then now they knew where all the guns were. He went and took them all. So basically, it's a registration thing. And they also had some rulings, and I sent it to you, but you didn't pick up on that. But they also had the state police now require you to renew your concealed carry permit through them. These are county issued permits issued by a judge in the county. So now the state's taking over, and they're getting all that information on who has concealed carry permits, but they're requiring people to do it. Okay, so now we have two things. Gun registration, all semi-automatic rifles that look bad have to be registered, and you have to renew your gun permit through the New York State Police. First, let's go to the gun.
Don't forget the DOJ is involved, because they get involved in the background check. So this is also de facto registration with the Department of Justice, federal gun registration here, if you apply for a concealed carry permit.
Right. So let's start off first with the gun registration. Basically it was ARs or AKs or stuff like that. Those military style semi-automatic rifles. They were required back. I think it's over a year ago now. It might have been a year ago, this last January. All those rifles had to be registered with the state of New York. They estimate there's about 2 million ARs, AKs, those military style variants in the state of New York. They got 200,000 registered. So they got about 10%. So the vast majority of people just ignored the law. Now, as far as the state police recertification of your concealed carry permit, they had such a low percentage of people actually recertify with them. They extended the deadline for another year because no one was obeying it. So people ignored those laws. There's acts of civil disobedience. In reality, the majority of people that did ignore these laws are now actually felons in the state of New York. But there's so many of them, they can't possibly go and get them all. So there's the answer. You have in your state, if it's that egregious, you just have to. It's going to require civil disobedience.
Well, and then I also said, and then in the instance, if you get caught, then we have the option of jury nullification. So again, I advocate thumbing your nose at the law. If you find that it is an infringement upon your rights. And now again, I'm distinguishing between laws that are prescribing behavior that is just bad. We call that malum in se. And laws that are bad, like stealing from somebody else, personally harming somebody else, property theft, assaults, physical assaults, that sort of thing. Obviously, those are laws that I would convict if I knew somebody. If I was sitting on a jury and the prosecution could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a woman was harmed, a man assaulted a woman, or somebody broke into a home and stole something. That's not what I'm talking about here. But if somebody, for instance, and this will be a good segue into our next topic, if I found that somebody was facing jail time over possession of marijuana, and I personally felt that that law was unjust as applied to that individual, you as a juror have a right to refuse to convict. Now, the interesting thing is we will be told as jurors with jury instructions that if you find that the people proved A, B, and C, you must convict. And that's absolutely not the case. So again, if somebody is on trial, for instance, for having a concealed firearm on their person and they don't have a permit, would I convict under those circumstances? Absolutely not. I also want to return to a topic when we were talking about the students with regards to this begging for gun control that we've been seeing here. You know, a few weeks ago, these kids were eating Tide Pods. Now they're snorting condoms. But all of a sudden, we have all these people that are cheering them on for organizing and taking matters into their own hands. Jeff, I'm seeing beyond this. And what I'm thinking is, if you look at the egregious disregard for the very frightening behavior of Nicholas Cruz before this transpired, my personal thought is they sat on this and they were waiting for something to happen. Emma Gonzalez, that skinhead lesbian, laughed and said, I knew he was the one that did the shooting. We taunted him. We bullied him for years. But clearly the effort is focusing on gun control, not the behavior and how these kids are treated. You know, it's something, I'm going to just digress for a minute. This kid, from what I understand, was autistic. And they admitted to taunting him. I actually had a conversation with somebody who had sent me a song in a private message, and I really liked it. So I contacted him and said, do you mind if I use this on our show? And I'd like to help promote you and sell the album. So we were talking yesterday, and he told me that he was autistic, higher functioning. He has Asperger's. But he said school for him was really awful. And we had a very long discussion. And as they expand these background checks, they're going to include kids like him, people like him, autistic, Asperger's, these people that are high functioning that will fit into a mold because you have to have a label so insurance companies can be paid when their physicians examine them and discuss some of these symptoms that they're having. Now, are these kids, are all of them, is there a blanket exception that they are somehow unqualified to have a firearm? Absolutely not. But this is just a means by which we can cast a wide net. Let me go to this article. This was in the National Review. And this was a school in Georgia, Hampton Middle School in Hampton, Georgia. The students were given a homework assignment that required them to write a letter asking lawmakers for stricter gun control laws. Now, after I had pulled my kids out of school in California, granted, this was even a private school, but you know, there's no different pool from which private school educators are taken as opposed to the public school teachers. In fact, most of them, when they would get their master's degrees, couldn't wait to just shuffle on over for the higher paying public school system where they could suck off the taxpayer pit and have their big pensions for the rest of their lives. But my kids' classmates told them they were given an assignment, why I like President Obama. Not a discussion about him, good or bad or both, but why I like him. Not liking him wasn't even an option. Anything negative wasn't even an option. I got to tell you, my kids begged me to put them back in the class so they could go in there and turn in a blank sheet of paper. But let me get to this middle school article. They were given a homework assignment that required them to write a letter asking lawmakers for stricter gun control laws. The 7th grade social science assignment, a copy of which was obtained by Blue Lives Matter, stated, and I'm going to quote you here for the instructions. For this assignment, you are writing a letter to the lawmakers of the United States. Well, there, first of all, what does that tell you, Jeff? The Second Amendment is irrelevant. So if we can foster into these kids the indoctrination that the Second Amendment is irrelevant, and these kids grow up, go to law school, become legislators, become lobbyists, advocating for gun control, there is your Second Amendment repeal absent an Article 5 convention and ratification of the states. This is the seed they are planting. Let me continue. Okay, so for this assignment, you'll be writing a letter to the lawmakers of the United States. The purpose of this letter is to pressure lawmakers to have stricter gun laws in the United States. Your letter should contain at least 5 complete sentences. Make sure that you use proper grammatical skills, writing the first letter. That was, you know, so that was the assignment here. Disregard the Constitution, disregard the rule of law in its entirety, but be a mouthpiece for the Marxists in the public indoctrination camps. Jeff, this goes back to Agenda 21, where they said they need to steal a generation of students so they will be compliant. This was the purpose of the public school system. I had a show on this on my old show, the Suzanne Option, with Connor Boyack of the Libertas Institute, and we discussed that the purpose of the public school system in Prussia was to create a malleable generation of future factory workers. Going back to the article, Blue Lives reports the teacher agreed to exempt, one guy complained, so they exempted his son from the assignment without penalty. I would have demanded, look, I want my son to be able to write an assignment against further gun control, but you're not allowed to do that. It's either write a pro-gun control assignment or don't write anything at all. And we're seeing this with the protests when people are showing up, for instance, in the walkouts, the violent silencing of messages in opposition to the gun control message. In fact, somebody that wanted to speak out at the March for Our Lives presentation was not allowed to speak because he was not in the direct agenda of gun control. And that little Hogs brat said, oh, it was just a miscommunication that he wasn't allowed to speak. So we're just seeing a march towards more gun control in absolute disregard for why these kids are going back to the schools, shooting up at the schools, rather than any other place where they could maybe get more people. The schools are the source of these kids' pain. The schools are the source of why these kids are drugged. Am I justifying the behavior? No, but we're putting a Band-Aid on. It's like using a Band-Aid when you have cancer. We're not looking at the big picture. The ultimate goal, and this is they're willing to disregard everybody's pre-existing rights for the furtherment of gun control and the big government agenda. Do you want to share any thoughts on that, Jeff?
Well, there's a couple of things you said, and I want to touch on. Going back to the idea of the autism and all these others. Number one is that is the way they're going to take away everyone's rights. Natural right to self-defense. They have to take them away, so they're going to use whatever means they can. Now, I've warned for years, one of the most benign questions you'll get when you go to the doctor's offices is how are you sleeping? That is a mental health question. There is a reason behind that question, and it is not to find out if you're sleeping okay, or maybe you have sleep apnea or something. No, that's not why they're asking that. They're asking that because if you answer in the affirmative that you're having difficulty sleeping, you are immediately put on a mental health. That is a mental health issue. You are immediately put in as having some form of mental illness. So now, after you answer yes to that question, they can come and take your firearms away because you've answered in an affirmative to a mental health question. So that this whole thing's a Trojan horse. All this gun control by mental health is a Trojan horse. It's a way they can take your firearms from you under the couch of law. Now, you also hit on something. I sent you an article earlier today, and this is from the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs. And you can go right to that website. It's UNODA, and it's part of the UN, obviously. And click on the icon that says sustainable communities. I'm pretty sure that's what it said on there. Sustainable communities. And you and I talked about this with Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. So now we're going to go into paragraph reducing illicit arms flows. The 2030 agenda acknowledges the link between arms regulation and development, as well as between illicit trafficking in arms and organized crime. I asked you before the show, we were doing a little show prep, who is the organized crime that they're discussing? I mean, everyone out there would probably go, well, it's the mafia, it's this and that. Let's go to the Second Amendment, the restriction on the general government, and let's find out what they're saying there. Amendment 2, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep their arms shall not be infringed. So who are the criminals, Suzanne?
Well, me, I'll always say the government. And this is the distinction I make too. because you just quoted the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I tell people that's what it says. What it does not say is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. This amendment heretofore grants thee the right to keep and bear arms. There's a huge difference, because people say, well, it's the same thing. It is absolutely not the same thing. And we're seeing this piecemeal abandonment going back to the 1934 Firearms Act, which came about as a result of the temerity and the blazing violence of the organized crime after prohibition of alcohol.
Right. We'll get into that discussion in a minute, because we really need to move on and get to that article. But first, there was one other thing I thought about when I was reading that earlier. What state are they talking about? Out there, really think about this. The people that are out there listening, please think about this. What state is the Second Amendment protecting? Is it the Blobistan of the United States of America? Why did they add this? To keep the general government from misconstruction or abuse of its power. They added further restrictive and declaratory clauses to keep that from happening. So what state is this as the militia to protect? I mean, obviously, the 50 nation states. I mean, we really have made this way more difficult than it has to be. It's not that difficult.
Well, also, if you look into with the various firearms regulations and the Congress trying to take over national control of firearms, federal marijuana laws, education, I mean, you name it, they're into everything. Look at the American Community Survey. You can get that. It's on a PDF. Just look it up. And again, we have the red flag questions in there. They never ask you about firearms. They ask you about everything else, including who has spent more than 3 nights in your home. But just missing from there, again, if they're asking all these questions from how do you heat your home, what kind of toilets do you have, what kind of faucets, how many refrigerators, I mean, it's just absolutely insane. But we have these marker questions. Do you need help dressing yourself? How are you sleeping? There was actually a school assignment. I don't know if you remember this, but they asked kids to go into their parents' medicine cabinets, make a list of the medications for whom they were prescribed and for what symptoms. When we have all of this linked now in a federal system, this information does not go away. Let me quote St. George Tucker. The Congress of the United States possesses no power to regulate or interfere with the domestic concerns or police of any state. It belongs not to them to establish any rules respecting the rights of property, nor will the Constitution permit any prohibition of arms to the people. This stuff has been forgotten. And you know, Jeff, when we talk about 18th century ideas for 21st century thinkers, we need to bring these thoughts back, these words of wisdom from our founding generation, because I'm telling you right now, we don't have that anymore. Remember, Professor Gruber said that they were able to pass the Affordable Care Act thanks to the stupidity of the American voter. They came out and just admitted that they know that we're stupid and they can do whatever they want. And we just now figure out how are we going to work within this system that has been imposed upon us. Look at the debt. We're about to get into another war. I tell you what, I live in the mountains and I told my kids, if we get into a war like this, I know a million places I can hide my kids. They're not going to go and fight that war over in Syria. By the way, that's really the last bastion. That's the last stronghold in the Middle East for Christians. And we're going to take out that leader.
Yeah, this is this whole thing is just completely ridiculous. Where's the logic in any of this? I mean, we really want to go to war with Russia, and that's what's going to entail. It's not going to be just Syria. We're going to be at war with Russia. I mean, they are there. Syria is their ally. If we go to war there, and I saw one of the articles that Trump was saying that he was going to shoot missiles at bases that house Russian military personnel. If we start killing their personnel, where does this end up? It ends up in a wider war, and the only winner again is these corporations, Boeing, Raytheon, and all these others that build all these weapons to sell all around the world.
Yep. I was looking at this article also out of Daily Mail. Deadly S-400 anti-aircraft missile ring of steel protects Assad. And this is coming out of Russia, saying that they will not only shoot down any missiles of ours, but they will also shoot the sources of these missiles. So how far out are we going to go? Are they going to actually go to missile silos in the United States where we have our nuclear warheads? I mean, ostensibly, this could result in an all-and-out nuclear war. Oh, Suzanne, will you just stop it? You know, you're just a prepper up in the mountain, always preaching your doomsday stuff. But theoretically, this does have the potential to go full scale. I am so glad I'm up here in the mountains and prepared. I feel really bad for people that are stuck in metropolitan areas or that aren't ready. I think we're going to see one way or the other some sort of disturbance, either from here or look at our debt now. They were talking about now more trillions of dollars in debt. We're just going to keep going the way we're going. We had the Republicans in charge, and we doubled down on spending with loss of revenue. I see nothing but insanity all around me. Are you there,
again,
Jeff?
this government? Yeah, I'm sorry. This government's gonna double down. This government is not going to change. And again, it really is. Come on, listeners out there, it's time to start thinking. How are we going to make this change? The only way we're going to change anything related to the general government in Washington D.C. To that Leviathan is if we start changing our states. That's why you'll see me posting stuff from Dan Fisher running for governor in Oklahoma. Unless we start putting people out there that are actual Federalists that believe in the sovereignty of the people of the states, it's not the state. Again, we're not talking about a sovereign state. We're talking about the sovereignty of the people, the citizens of those states. Until we start recognizing that the states hold the key to the solution, we're just going to keep going the way we are. It's not going to change. We're going to keep going down this $1 trillion after $1 trillion being stolen from the people of the states, and we're going to be in wars all over the world. We're going to have standing armies that are taking away our liberty. It's not going to change. We got to start at the states and start saying no. That's why Dan Fisher, if he becomes governor, he's going to say no to the courts. They're going to work to abolish abortion in that state, and the courts, have no authority anyway. And he's going to tell them they have no authority, and he's just going to ignore them.
And the interesting thing is, we see marijuana concerns so successful in the states. And if only we had the temerity to have this sort of success when it comes to the murdering of our babies, which again is such a hypocrisy, where we're up in arms over people getting gassed in Syria, yet we have an American Holocaust going on every single day. How many thousands of babies are going to be killed today? But going back to federalism, I want to discuss for the remainder of the show an article that I wrote that talks about federalism, marijuana, prohibition, Article 5 amendments, and where we are right now. Because we talked about earlier, when I mentioned St. George Tucker, about the United States having no power over policing of any state. Yet we see the militarization of the police forces at local levels from federal funding. We see all these grants. Weapons of war are okay for the government to have, but apparently an AR-15 is considered a weapon of war simply because it looks like a military weapon. Again, my article will be coming out in a week or two on that. I think it's going to make some make some people really question the focus of the pro-gun movement as well. But my article starts out here by saying that Republicans sure do love their war on drugs. since the Obama administration, or during the Obama administration. I remember Senator Ted Cruz chiding the president, and this is, again, our constitutional conservative, our originalist candidate who wasn't eligible, by the way, chiding the president for failing to enforce federal marijuana laws, even though his administration, the Obama administration, spent more in just his first term than Bush and Clinton combined. Now that Donald Trump is president, we see Attorney General Jeff Sessions planning to renew this national war on drugs targeting marijuana, also civil asset forfeiture. That's a huge boon. It's a great source of revenue for the police department's absolute slap in the face for our rights to due process. But according to the Constitution, does any administration have the authority to wage a war on drugs? And when I say administration, I mean a presidential administration. Can the federal government, in conformance with the Constitution, now meaning the legislature, prohibit the production and distribution and the use of marijuana? If so, do the federal laws trump those of the states? And if they do not, is there a means by which the federal government, Congress, can supersede state regulations that may be in conflict with federal law? So we have to look at Title 21, United States Code Section 811, sets forth the provisions of the Controlled Substance Act. While I'm going through this, Jeff, maybe you can look through Article 1, Section 8 and find out where controlled substances are authorized for the general government. So the Drug Enforcement Agency's website places controlled substances regulated under federal law into 5 categories. We call them schedules. So pursuant to federal law, and somebody had to pay a lot of money to get this to happen, marijuana is considered a Schedule 1 drug. This puts it in the same class as cocaine and heroin and LSD. So to determine what category it fits into, the code requires certain factors are going to be considered here. So marijuana is considered a Schedule 1 drug because the government has concluded marijuana, first, has a high potential for abuse, 2, has no accepted medical benefit, and 3, it cannot be considered safe. Never mind the fact that nobody's ever overdosed from marijuana. Compare that to opioid use. Again, they create a crisis and then more government involvement is needed to solve it. So let's look now at the Supremacy Clause, because we have a lot of this with regards to these issues that we've been discussing. So Article 6, Clause 2 is the Supremacy Clause. The Constitution and the laws of the United States, and here's the caveat, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, are considered the supreme law of the land. So according to the Supremacy Clause, federal marijuana laws must be made in pursuance to the Constitution, meaning the states must have delegated the power to regulate this plant. Well, I'm thinking by now, Jeff, you've been looking through Article 1, Section 8, and it's not there. So we're going to continue with the assumption that it does not exist. So again, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by the states are reserved to these states, respectively, or to the people. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the 10th Amendment. Presently, the states have regulations acknowledging various freedoms regarding marijuana use, ranging from regulated use for medical purposes, allowing for regulated, meaning taxed, recreational use, to decriminalizing the possession of small amounts of the plant. So we're looking at a couple issues here. First, the states are ignoring federal law. And second, there is an inconsistency in laws among the several states. Does that sound familiar? If so, that harkens back to my national reciprocity argument here and use justification for the feds wanting to crack down on that because there's inconsistency in state laws. But ladies and gentlemen, that is the heart and soul of federalism. So we have an inquiry now as to how to approach this situation. Must there be one national approach, pardon my French, to dealing with marijuana, or is it acceptable that the state laws are varied? And I think you can tell where I'm going here. James Madison, Edmund Randolph, I talked about this before. They proposed a strong central government at the Philadelphia Convention. They called this the Virginia Plan. James Wilson also was supportive of this system, which would effectively render the states mere subsidiaries, or as Alexander Hamilton wanted, corporations in an abandonment of their sovereign nature. Again, the Virginia Plan never made it to the ratification conventions. They shut that down in Philadelphia. Madison even acknowledged, despite his support of the Virginia Plan, that the powers of the general government were few and defined, and those which were to remain with the states were numerous and indefinite. Even in Federalist 39, he said that the act of establishing the Constitution was not a national act, but a federal act, meaning the general government had limited responsibilities with adequate resources by which they could pursue them. So based on the foregoing, one must conclude that there is no constitutional authority vested in Congress to regulate marijuana. So how can the feds do so lawfully? Well, this goes back to a discussion we had earlier about Article 5. And in fact, they did invoke Article 5 amendment when it came to the regulation and prohibition of alcohol. The 18th Amendment was ratified on January 16, 1919, when Nebraska became the 36th state to ratify. The amendment delegated the general government the authority. They didn't take it for themselves, absent these states. It delegated them the authority to prohibit alcoholic beverages. This ushered in the Prohibition era. Congress passed enabling legislation that came to be known as the Volstead Act. Now, we have marijuana legislation to prohibit or to enforce and make it easy to make Congress pursue their marijuana laws, but we don't have the constitutional amendment. In fact, the pre-existence of this policy was the way Justice Scalia justified some of these marijuana laws. So I'm going to have to get into more of that on another show. But we have now the $64,000 question, I refer to it in here, on federal marijuana legislation. It took a constitutional amendment to empower the federal government to ban alcohol sales and distribution. How is it that the federal government has the power to ban marijuana with no such amendment, which, by the way, prohibition was repealed on January 17th, 1920. I'm sorry, 1930, it was repealed. So we have to understand that it is clear the only way to fight the war on drugs is to amend the Constitution. Again, it can be amended by one of two ways. Either both houses must pass resolutions calling for such by a two-thirds majority, and the states may also do so with a two-thirds majority, but either way, 3/4 of the states must ratify it. So assuming now we have a constitutional amendment, do we even really want to, or have we learned our lesson from the failure of prohibition? Jeff, I submit to you. Yeah.
Suzanne, I just want to, for those of the people out there, because you'll get this all the time, you get the more moralicist, whatever. I'm not going to, for the English speaking people, you know what I meant. You got people out there that are all up in arms about the idea of marijuana being legalized. Yet they're willing to have legislatively it done in contravention to the Constitution. So basically, again, it's legislating an amendment to the Constitution outside the constitutional bounds. And how can I prove that? What did they have to do to outlaw the drug of alcohol? They had to amend the Constitution. So what is the difference between the drug of alcohol and the drug of marijuana? There is no difference. It's the exact same thing. This whole idea that we need to have just common sense legislation to ban this product. We need common sense legislation just to ban firearms. We need common sense legislation to ban this. We need that's a lie. We need a constitutional amendment. Thank you for letting me break in there.
and here's how they get by with it. Well, we have to do something, and we have to do it right away. Well, excuse me, a constitutional amendment is going to take longer than they really want to take for these emergency bits of legislation. By the way, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th in December in 1933. But the Valentine's Day, I mentioned the Valentine's Day massacre of 1929 is an example of the gangland violence that we had here. When we talk about having a prohibition, was a prohibition successful? So we have to ask ourselves, did people stop consuming alcohol? No. Did more people suffer from improperly manufactured alcohol? Yes. Did alcohol become a lucrative product of the black market and result in a dramatic increase in crime? Yes and yes. And I talk about the same Valentine's Day massacre. As a result, now we have an expansion of national power and an inevitably greater expansion of national power. It just seems to pile on top of itself. The National Firearms Act of 1934, predictable, although a blatantly unconstitutional response by Congress to the violence caused by prohibition. So we have a crisis created by government overreach, more unlawful government overreach, and the very same government is continuing this policy today. We have learned nothing from history. Do we really expect a different outcome if we go the insane but constitutional route of amending the Constitution to prohibit the nationwide growth, distribution, or consumption of a plant? And I wrap up by saying, or do we act in accordance with the principles of true federalism and allow the states to decide for themselves this issue? If we choose the former, then we are accepting the notion that we are incapable of self-governance. And if we accept that, we have surrendered our revolutionary legacy. Go ahead, Jeff.
Suzanne, do you remember, it's got to be at least a decade ago now, when Canada, they passed this just a draconian tax on cigarettes. They reduced the pack size from 20 to 10, and the packs went up in price to like $10 for 10 cigarettes, or maybe even more. I can't remember. This is a good decade plus ago. What happened was, the black market was coming across the lakes, and New York's right across from Canada. They were coming across in the lakes in boats. They were smuggling American 20 packs into Canada and selling them on the black market. They created this huge black market. It got to the point where their border guards were trying to stop these smugglers, and I think 2 or 3 or 4 of them were killed in the process of trying to stop the smuggling operation that their draconian laws created. So this whole idea that you can somehow legislate people to stop smoking that, or stop smoking marijuana, or stop drinking alcohol is a fool's errand. Are they bad? Absolutely. I don't do any of those. But the fact of the matter is, by government trying to get involved in creating these legislations, they're just going to create a black market, just as they already have. We could end this problem with the Mexican cartels by just getting rid of the war on drugs. We have about 2 minutes, about a minute 50. Suzanne, go ahead and wrap up. I'm sorry I took the end of the show here.
No, not at all. Again, well, we decided at the very last minute to do this show. We knew we were going to do this together. So I'm delighted that you're here and that you're chiming in. I'm actually looking out the window right now. And yesterday at this time, I was actually soaking in some rays outside. And right now it is snowing. Utah always has a surprise for us. Want to just wrap up by letting people know, speaking of Utah, we have PrepperCon coming up. I attended the event for the first time last year. My good friend Stan Pruitt, who has a self-defense and firearms academy out in the Sandy area, he's going to be coming on the show in the next week or two to discuss that. Coming up after this show, I'm actually going to be recording a podcast with my good friend Brian Duff of Mind for Survival. We're going to talk about the legalities and the implications of the use of lethal force, when you need to use it, when you should avoid using it, and get into some special conditions and considerations with and without firearms. So that's going to be a really great show. That will be available both on our network and on Mind for Survival. So I'm really grateful. Brian Duff is an Army Ranger, Army veteran, really knows this stuff, has a very great website, Mind for Survival, the digit 4. Check him out. And let's see, wrapping up, I think this will be our last show for the week. So we'll come back next week. I'm looking forward to getting my article out on assault rifles and the crazy nature of the ability for people to get away with arguing that they be banned. This is in direct violation too of our foundation, our founding principles. So I want to thank you, Jeff, for joining me, putting this together at the last minute. And I'm Suzanne Sherman. This is the Cerberus Radio Network, defending liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny.